a really special we have a really special night tonight with author Stephanie Barron. We are going to be doing some questions from Erin to Stephanie, and at the end, we will leave time for you to put into the chat if you have any questions. But I will ask for everyone to stay muted and also not to type into the chat right now. As a question comes to you, please don't put it into the chat because that makes the chat box pop up for everybody. So we're just asking to wait until we tell you that it's time to type in the chat, and then you can feel free to put your question in there. So I'm going to turn it over now to Erin, and you can take it away.
Thanks, Rachel. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our meeting of the Jane Austen Book Club. Tonight we have a very special guest joining us who may seem a little familiar. Her name is Stephanie Barron, and she is the author. We all know her as the author of the Jane Austen mystery series, but she has a very wonderful and diverse career that we're going to talk about. Some fun facts is after working in journalism, if I'm correct, you worked as an intelligence analyst for the CIA,
Yeah.
and around 1993, you decided to pursue your interest in publishing books. We have a special announcement that the first book in the series, the Jane and the Unpleasantness at Scarscale Manor, is being re-released, I believe, on June 10th as a special anniversary edition.
Yes,
Uh,
it is.
it is. And we also have the more recent publication, which is Jane and the Final Mystery, that we can all look forward to. Everyone, please join me in giving Stephanie Barron a warm welcome to tonight's meeting. Hi,
Thank you.
Stephanie. Thanks for joining us this evening.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
So we're going to start with our conversational Q&A, and then we'll open it up and see what everyone else wants to ask. My first question for you is, it says in your bio that John McPhee, a Pulitzer Prize winning author and a staff writer at the New Yorker, was of great influence on you. So we were wondering, who are some other writers or individuals that have inspired your interests and your writing over the years? And what is it about their writing or their stories that resonated with you so much?
Well, I think I should start with John. Um, John is a very special man in many people's lives in that he taught a class called the Literature of Fact. Um, Forgive me, folks. I have multiple dogs in the house tonight, and they are barking, unfortunately, because my husband just got home. Um, At any rate, John McPhee is now about 94 years old. He has taught he stopped teaching in 2018, I believe, at Princeton University, which is my alma mater. And he taught for 35 years. And I think there's a statistic that 1 out of 2 or 1 out of 3 of every students he taught went on to be a professional writer, either journalist, um, a writer of fact, which is how he views himself. He writes books, book-length nonfiction, and others like myself who write fiction. Alex Gonza, for example, who is the screenwriter and show director of both 24 and Homeland, is a McPhee grad. Um, Countless people that you will know if I brought up their names. And so he was phenomenal to have as a teacher because he was is a very quiet, very introspective, deep researching guy who cares profoundly about prose. And so every week you'd have a meeting with him after you had done his 12-person seminar, which was um, selective. You had to apply to enter it. And he would meet with you for an hour and he would go through your piece that you had written word by word. And his commentary is crystalline in my mind and in many instances. And I would say that he influenced how I structure my stories, how I carefully edit my word choice, how I think about environment when I'm writing a scene in terms of smell and vegetation and the precise terms for architecture. And it was a very deep dive into the essentials of considered editing, which very few writers get. writers get praised for their prose at different times in classes, but the hard work of being a writer as a career is fundamentally how you edit, how you learn to edit. And you start out dealing with the feedback from an editor that you're working with on a specific book, if you're fortunate enough to have your book purchased. And that's one form of tutelage. I benefited hugely from having a particular editor named Kate Misiak, who was at Random House and specialized in mystery fiction, but she did 22 of my novels with me. And over the course of 20 years with her, I began to not only anticipate what she was looking for, but value the dialogue that I had developed with her about the book. And invariably, the book emerged stronger and better and finer from that dialogue than it would have had I written and published it alone. So John sort of started that process of thinking deeply about editing as a skill and an art. And a really good editor can reinforce and broaden that. In terms of people I've read that I love, obviously Austen, Tolstoy, um, Dorothy Sayers, Patrick O'Brien, his series. In more contemporary terms, I absolutely love Tower French, Lucy Foley, I enjoy. Rachel, oh God, I'm sorry, I'm blanking. Forget that. At any rate, I have a number of people that I enjoy reading who are both crime writers, but then also more broadly fiction writers, I would say. So I love Ellen Hildebrand. I have written a series of detective novels on Nantucket Island featuring a female police officer on the island who is an island native. And I love the interplay of her books and mine, sort of, as I read hers as a reader. But I read very broadly. I read a lot of nonfiction, some of it obviously for research. And that's my favorite part of the writing process. So it absorbs a lot of my time and attention.
Now, how did you make the decision to base a mystery series on Jane Austen? And you mentioned you like Jane Austen. Well, what made you decide to actually do it?
Pregnancy. So to backtrack a little, I majored in European history in college and wrote my senior thesis on Napoleonic France, on a particular general named Michel Ney, who was a critical marshal in Napoleonic France and led the invasion of Moscow in 1812, and then was put in command of the rear guard as they were fleeing Russia. And he was the last man, this is the fable, but he was the last man out of Russia in the Grande Armée under Napoleon, diving into the river between the border between Russia and Poland and swimming the river as the last man out. I loved Napoleonic France. And when I was a child, I had this serendipitous connection that I think we all have as kids sometimes when we're reading, and it opens a world for us. And in my case, it was that I was young, I was 10, I was watching on TV the 1973 BBC production of War and Peace. And it ran 13 weeks over the winter, every Sunday in Masterpiece Theater. And I got very impatient about the storyline, and I started reading ahead in the book because, back then you didn't stream stuff. You watched it episodically, and you had to wait a week for each new hit to your, adrenaline for the storyline. So I started reading War and Peace, and I got totally involved in War and Peace as a 10-year-old. And then 2 years later, I'm 12, and I'm reading in my aunt's library Pride and Prejudice. And I suddenly realized they had been written in the same period, that on one side of the world was Eliza, Bennet, and Darcy in 1813, and on the other side of the world was Pierre and Natasha and Prince Andrei in Russia. And there was this sense suddenly of simultaneity in history and literature that just overwhelmed me. And I think because I'd grown up in the US, I had a sense of two periods in British history that were fictionalized. One being the Victorian and the other being the Tudor, you know. You either watched the Six Wives of Henry VIII, or you were watching something, by Dickens. And so I was putting together that there was this other period in between as a kid, and that launched my whole interest in both the Regency in England and then Napoleonic period in France. And it became a lifelong passion for me. So when I started thinking about writing a mystery series that was historical, because I started my writing career as a detective novelist with the contemporary series on Nantucket, I was pregnant. And I found personally pregnancy to be a somewhat hallucinatory experience. And I was reading Austen, as I often do in the winter. For whatever reason, that season is for me Austen time. And I started hearing her voice in my head. And my husband would say, well, come home from work and say, how was your day? What did you do today? And I'd say, well, it being evident that the weather should continue fine, we determined upon a pleasure party to the lake. So I was speaking in Austenese, and I thought, wow, wouldn't it be great to be able to use this language, which is so rich and so antithetical to the era we live in, where everything is in sound bites and texts and tweets and is designed to convey the briefest amount of information possible. Austen's language conveys at least 4 levels of meaning in every phrase of her dialogue. I wanted to be able to use that language, Erin, without hitting people over the head with it as an archaic prose form. So I thought, okay, what if I wrote a mystery novel using Austen's voice? And then I thought further, and I thought, okay, well, most of us have a very clear idea of Anne Elliot or Eliza Bennet or Eleanor Dashwood. And personally, I don't like people messing with my ideas of characters. So I was not at the time, this was 1992, 1994. I was pregnant with Sam. And nobody was writing Austen fan fiction. So it seemed like a comet of an idea to me. And I thought, well, rather than writing about her characters, what if I wrote about her herself? Because it struck me that people had a much less vivid notion of who Jane Austen was in 1994 than they did of her characters. And B, she lived in a society that predated the development of the police force in England. She lived in a society where justice was local and hierarchic, and it was managed by males in the gentry, of which she was a member. And she had access to those men. She particularly had access to them through her family. Her brother Edward was a magistrate in Kent. Her brother Edward took her through a jail in Kent, in Canterbury. She had one brother who was a banker. She had another brother who was a clergyman. She had 2 brothers in the Royal Navy. And so her tentacles reached all through Regency society, and through her associations, which were intimate and informal and relational, she was able to gather information as a detective would. And it made sense that she was an amateur because there was no formal police force. So I loved that aspect of her time. And I felt that she herself was uniquely suited to the role, because the thing that brings us back over and over to Austen's works is her profound perception of human motivation, of the working of the human heart. And encompassed in that is a vivid comprehension of the ways in which we deceive and misguide one another, which is the counterfoil to the working of the human heart. It's the ways we protect ourselves or try to subvert others. And so there's always, the characters in her books that are the most smiling and beguiling and charming are invariably the most manipulative and evil. And so that perception on her part of the complexity of human interaction and also of the depth of deception and sense of betrayal that can be intimate between two people seemed to me just ideally suited for a mystery novel.
Now, what is it about Jane Austen, your version of Jane Austen, and your series that you enjoy the most?
Her wit.
Hmm.
Whenever I write, I have written, I should say, frequently about real people. So I've written a novel about Queen Victoria and Albert called A Flaw in the Blood. I've written a book about Virginia Woolf and Vita Sackville-West called The White Garden. I have a book about Jack Kennedy called Jack 1939. Ian Fleming, Too Bad to Die. Whenever I write a book about a human who actually existed, I want to get past the two-dimensionality of their public figure, which is what everybody brings to the story. And you have to penetrate that, or your reader is always going to be battling the image they have of a person. For instance, Jack Kennedy at 44, in that straitjacket of his back brace, deeply tanned skin, older man. I was writing about a 22-year-old kid who was struggling in college and with personal illness. And when I wrote about Jane, I had to similarly sit down with her voice. And in my case, it was the letters, the collected letters, which are first person, different voice from the prose, which is very passive voice, heavily edited and massaged, omniscient. Her letters are intimate and they are her voice profoundly. And they're collected. Let me see if I can find the volume. Well, I'll look at that in a minute. But at any rate, the Deirdre LeFay edition of the Oxford Collected Letters is available to anybody. I wanted to think about what drilled down to her essence. And I felt reading the letters, they start when she's 20 and they go until her death at 41 and a half. What emerged for me was her incredibly vicious wit. She was a deeply funny woman, very sarcastic, and merciless in the things she said about other people. So, for instance, the DeBarrys, the endless DeBarrys, put in their appearance dressed all in black, and I was as civil to them as their bad breath allowed me. That's one letter. She's writing to her sister Cassandra in these letters, so she's able to be very intimate. Mrs. Hall of Sherborne was brought to bed recently, a dead child, several weeks before she expected, owing, it is said, to a sudden fright. I suppose she happened to look at her husband. I mean, just hilarious stuff that she would say about her neighbors, her friends, people that Cassandra knew. And, she was trying to make Cassandra laugh. But it was inflexible on her part. She was always jabbing people. And it comes out in her, I think, her sub-characters, her secondary characters in the books, the way she portrays, for example, Mrs. Norris in Mansfield Park, or more gently, Miss Bates in Emma. But her secondary characters are the vehicles for her incredible humor. And I thought, she says later in her life that she terrifies people because they are always wondering what she's thinking when she's looking at them, because they know she's thinking something and it's going to be. And I think she derived a lot of power, personal sense of power at being able to subject people who were of higher standing than she or of greater fortune than she was, to her wit, that by mastering them verbally, she somehow subjected them to her power. And I found that to be an essential clue to how she thought, how she moved, how she lived in her world.
Now, you have an extensive background working in journalism and then working in intelligence with the CIA. And we know you have your standalone titles, which, if anyone hasn't checked them out, you should definitely check them out. Um, but is there any way that you used your experiences from that work and did you put it towards writing the Jane Austen mystery series? Were you able to incorporate anything
I think
from
there's one very strong thread, yes, in the Austen books, and that is that people tend to dismiss her engagement with the world,
Hmm,
her world, which was a world of war and politics
hmm,
and incredible upheaval following the French Revolution. And it was a period of turmoil throughout the world that culminated in 1815 in the Congress of Vienna and the redistribution of the entire European map. But all of that was the result of the American Revolution in 1775, the year of Jane's birth, the revolutions in France, and the upheavals in the European principalities that Napoleon would eventually conquer. And that period of turmoil was one that Jane fully appreciated, and people don't necessarily understand that. They see her as writing these genteel stories of love and romance and ballrooms. But from the very first line or scene of Pride and Prejudice, when Eliza Bennet is forced to sit down from the scarcity of gentlemen, the scarcity of gentlemen is due to the fact that most were, like Jane's two brothers, in the Navy, or they were in the Army. The men who could afford not to be doing that were few and far between and elusive socially. And so, just as in World War I in Britain, there was a generation of women who went unmarried, and Jane and Cassandra are reflective of that, as many of their peers were. Jane read newspapers. She wrote constantly to her two brothers and followed their naval careers. You get a sense of that in Persuasion. In her letters, she comments constantly on the politics of the day, the machinations of government, various appointments of generals in the peninsula. And so I wanted to emphasize the political and the espionage aspect of warfare in which she lived from the period, the date of her birth, 1775, until her death in 1817. It was an uninterrupted period of warfare in Britain and on the continent. And that dictated almost everything about her life. It dictated economies. It dictated which goods were available, which were being embargoed, which were being blockaded from the continent. It conscribed people's movements. She never went to Europe because it was a dangerous place to go until the very end of her life. There's a wonderful letter she wrote in 1805 from Kent when she was staying with her brother Edward, who was the wealthy landowner of the family due to an adoption by cousins who left him their estates. They were childless and they wanted him as an heir. And so he became much more powerful than anybody in Austen's nuclear family. And she was staying with him. He was the magistrate in Kent. And Kent, it was like the Greenwich of England at the time, very wealthy. She's writing to Cassandra, who's staying at a neighboring estate. And she says, the movement of the militia next week is a source of great despair among the gentlemen in our circle, due to the depredation they expect upon the birds. And it's a very odd sentence, and you're reading the letter and you're like, what the hell is she talking about? And then you break it apart and you realize that in 1805, Britain was steeling itself against the threat of invasion from Napoleon, who had amassed 300 ships across the Channel and was preparing, they thought, by September to invade Britain. And Jane's two brothers were on the blockade in the Channel, so they were risking their lives. She's in Kent, outside of Canterbury, right on the Channel. They had plans for an evacuation that month, that whole summer. It was August that I was researching. And August 12th is the beginning of grouse season, the glorious 12th in Britain. And so while she's worried about her brothers blockading the French who are about to invade, her other brother, Edward, is training militia in the neighborhood to forestall the invasion and has an evacuation plan for his estate and all his people. the other gentlemen in the neighborhood are worried about the fact that the militia are going to trample the fields, flush the birds, and the Glorious 12th is going to be a bust for grouse hunting. So she's writing about all of this, and Cassandra knows the background, so she doesn't explain it all. But embedded in all of her letters is this vivid sense of exactly what's happening that week, politically, militarily, socially. And I find that utterly fascinating, the complexity that's there to be teased out and used, in my case, in the book, Jane and the Genius of the Place, which is set during that week. That's just, one thing I tried to do. I also have a character named Lord Trowbridge, and later other characters who are connected tenuously, quietly to Britain's intelligence service, which they did have back then, as early as 1810. And that brings some of the political intrigue into the plots as well.
Now, in your series, Jane gets to, well, before I get to that one, was there anything interesting, unexpected, or surprising that you uncovered when you were researching or putting your books together?
I would say probably one of the more speculative aspects that I uncovered and took up as mine, but I can't prove, is sort of a factor in her death. I was writing the book before the final book, which is called Jane and the Year Without a Summer, which is set in 1816. And The Year Without a Summer is the year Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. It was a horrific climate event throughout the world. It affected the US, it affected Europe, due to a volcanic eruption in Indonesia. And it created such a thick ash cloud that there was no summer. It rained constantly, crops failed, there was famine in both the US and throughout Europe. And it was effectively the final summer of Jane Austen's life. She died the following July, but that year she was bedridden, so it didn't really count. And she, knowing she was ill, went to a spa to try and revive her health. But it's unmitigatedly raining. It's 45 degrees. It's a horrible year. At any rate, I was looking at the fact that this was the year she got sick, and she had been very healthy her whole life. And I thought, what about it at 40 would cause a change? And she died speculatively, forensic physicians think, of Addison's disease, which is an autoimmune disease that attacks your adrenal glands, which regulates sodium levels throughout your body. It's the same disease Jack Kennedy had. So I had researched Addison's quite a bit in writing his book, and now was facing it with Jane. And on a sudden whim, I think because I had gone through menopause, I thought, wow, I wonder. I just sort of started researching Addison's and menopause in women. And it turns out that if you have early onset menopause, which is defined as 40 or younger, according to the NIH, you are 300% more likely to develop Addison's disease. And she was dead within a year and a half of 40. And I thought, wow, what if she had early onset menopause and it triggered Addison's, and that's how she died? So I worked that into my plot. And I would by no means suggest that that's necessarily true, but I found it a very interesting connection. So, it's little things like that I said that you can kind of tease out of. All of my books about Jane are mosaics of fact and fiction. And I draw heavily on fact, context, details of the day that I'm writing about in her record. To give you an idea, in the second book, Jane and the Man of the Cloth, it's set in Lyme Regis, and she wrote a couple of letters from 1803 in Lyme Regis. And she mentions everyone in their social circle to Cassandra. She mentions knowing a particular doctor who, it turns out, when I researched it, was the coroner of Lyme. So he would have handled any suspicious death. And I ended up incorporating all of the people she mentions as characters in the book, and one is the murderer and one is the victim. And so I thought when I first started writing these that I was writing Easter egg puzzles for readers who knew all this stuff and would be thrilled to figure it out and put it together. And eventually I realized that, in fact, I was writing for some readers who had never heard Jane Austen's name, had no association with her. I had one person come up to me and say, "This Jane Austen you write about, she lived?" So, it's interesting to me because you can read the books on many levels, and you can be someone who's thoroughly immersed as a Janeite or a member of Jasna would be in her life and her work, and recognize the phrases I drop in there that are direct quotations from her prose. Or you can be somebody who just likes a historical mystery and has no idea.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. I think for some of us in the group, that's like, we're like,
It's astonishing.
wow.
I had one woman ask me if she was the Jane who had founded Hull House in Chicago. I have people who constantly give me editions of Jane Eyre and say, "I know how much you love her." Oh, so
At
it's a
least,
wide tent.
at least it's
You
the
can't
same
be very
name,
wide.
and at least the same first name.
Uh-huh.
So now in your series, Jane gets to go, as you mentioned, some of the locations. She gets to go to some very interesting locations across the series.
Yes.
Were you familiar with the locations before you started the series? Did you visit them? What was that experience like creating those settings?
I mean, it was wonderful. It's wonderful. The nice thing is, uh, you only have to visit them once because, I mean, not that you wouldn't want to visit them multiple times, but you can kind of I did my entire series location research in one trip because where she lived is fixed in the record, right? But then there are the rambling aspects, like it is generally accepted that she never went north of the Store River in England, i.e., she did not go into Derbyshire. But so many of her references in Pride and Prejudice, for example, seem authentic. Now, she could have gotten that information from one of her brothers. She was frequently asking them about different landscapes, etc. But I looked at the period in which she was working on editing Pride and Prejudice, and during that period, she had gone as far north as Staffordshire, which is the county right below Derbyshire, and was staying for several weeks with her cousin Edward Cooper. Edward Cooper was a clergyman. He had 10 children. They all had whooping cough. And I thought, what if he decided to get Jane, her sister, and her mother out of town while the 10 kids had whooping cough and drove them to Bakewell, which is the town she mentions in Derbyshire, which is right outside of Chatsworth, where she sets Pride and Prejudice. There's no record of that because she was staying with her mother and Cassandra, so she wasn't writing letters. But it seemed entirely plausible to me that she actually had gone into Derbyshire. Um, so I set a book there. Um, that's Jane and the Still Room Maid. So on the other hand, you can visit the places that are known, like Portsmouth, where she lived with her brother Frank for years, Chawton, obviously, Bath, Lyme Regis, um, Dorset, where she sets a good bit of Sense and Sensibility. London, she stayed in 2 different places in London with her brother, um, Henry. And so all of those places you can go to. The problem is you will never see them lit only by fire. All of them have been renovated. Several have been bombed in World War II, particularly Portsmouth and Southampton. Portsmouth is a reconstruction. She lived in Southampton. Her brother Frank was a naval captain out of Portsmouth at the time on half pay. He had been turned on land. So, and they're 11 miles apart. So they're basically an area, but because they were ports, they were bombed heavily. So a lot of what she would have seen is gone.
Hmm.
So it's always an exercise of the imagination to try to access Jane's world. And you do that as a researcher as well as a reader.
Now, in some of the books, Jane Austen does encounter some very interesting and even some famous figures from her time. How did you decide on which different characters you wanted to include in the series? And was there any specific inspiration behind them?
So I did introduce the Iron Duke, the Duke of Wellington, in part because they were in London at the same time. And I found that interesting. And her brother Henry, who was the banker, was a kind of, I don't want to say admitted to, but on the periphery of the Prince Regent's circle because he lent money to them, members of the Prince Regent's circle, and was in and out of Carlton House where the Prince Regent lived. Jane notes him going to a celebratory party at White's Club that was attached to the party was for the Regent after Waterloo. And so his access to those circles I found interesting. So I felt it was something that I could use. Also, Jane did dedicate Emma to the Prince Regent, whom she disliked intensely. But she did so because the Regent's librarian asked her to. And this all occurred, it's the 6 degrees of separation that I find fascinating in her life. Her brother Henry becomes ill. Because he's a friend of the Regent's own physician comes to attend to Henry. Jane is there taking care of him. Edward is there. Cassandra's there because they are all convinced Henry's going to die. And his wife has already died, so he's alone. So they have assembled at Henry's, what they think is his deathbed. The Regent's physician successfully treats him, and he recovers. But in the process of being in that household, he realizes Jane Austen is an authoress because she is going through her typeset pages of Emma. And he goes back to the Regent's house, Carlton House, and says, I just met the author of Pride and Prejudice. And the Regent is so thrilled that his librarian then contacts Jane and says, you have to dedicate Emma to the Regent. So suddenly, not only is this anonymous author's name out, it's out to the Prince Regent. She is forced to dedicate the next book to Emma. And the librarian says, I want you to come to Carlton House and I will give you a personal tour of the premises. So she goes to Carlton House. And if you went to Carlton House in the middle of the day, in the middle of the week, in November of 1814, you're going to run into all these people who are notable, So that was all handed to me. That is all fact. And then I just get to think, well, who did she run into at Carlton House? And in my case, she runs into a body in the library. But, you have to use the body in the library when it is handed to you, right? So that's the background of Jane and the Waterloo map. These things fall into your lap. Henry also was friends with a man and his wife who was an opera singer, and they had them to their house when Eliza, his wife, was living. Their house in Hans Place, which was a beautiful Georgian row house that Jane stayed in, not far from Harrods. And so he has Jane there. He has the couple who are Russian and French emigres, and it turns out they were both Russian and French spies. And they were murdered in their beds about 2 months later after Jane met them. Who can make this stuff up? People think of her as this retiring spinster in the country, but she was moving in fascinating circles. She had amazing connections. And I just love tapping into that and pointing it out to readers that, she's not the obscure damsel unmarried in the countryside. It's important to me to give that back to her because she was such an agent of her own life. You know, if anything, she had agency, and that matters so much to me. She exercised it throughout her life, and by God, it's a disservice to see her as this, you know, mute, um, in a rocking chair, scribbling words in silence.
Mm. So what is one of the biggest rewards that you felt uh, for writing the Jane Austen series? Is there a personal reward that you felt? Any sort of encounters with people that have felt wonderful? Any fun
Oh,
stories?
yeah. I mean, the whole Jane Eyre world is phenomenal. Some of the most interesting people I know are Austen aficionados, and they assembled to celebrate her, and that's been a wonderful gift. I think being able to see the appreciation for her grow over the 30 years that I've written this series, and it has been 30 years, 3 decades. The transformation of Austen appreciation has been profound since the late 1990s, I would say. And I think that she's due that. And so it's been wonderful to me to see people appreciate her and feel that that has been something that I've been able to participate in. But frankly, the greatest privilege has been feeling that I have been adrift on the sea of Jane Austen's mind for 3 decades, because she had such a rich interior life that throwing my voice and inhabiting it for a while has been a gift in itself.
Now, as you know, this is coming up is the 250th birthday anniversary for Miss Jane Austen, and I was just wondering, before we get to our fun group questions, do you have any special plans to celebrate Miss Austen this year?
I don't really. I um, have been invited to speak at a conference about her in France in March, but that's next spring. And I'm looking forward to that very much, at a university in Nancy, France. But other than that, I don't really have a plan. It'll probably be something like I'll reread Persuasion, which is my favorite of her novels, um, on her birthday, you know.
Great. So now we do have some member questions that were submitted to us. Let me see. Rachel, would you like to ask one to get us started?
Sure. We had one question. They wanted to know how much input do you have on your cover art and your titles for your books?
The titles are entirely mine. Sometimes I'm able to influence the cover art. In the early editions, which were published by Random House, um, that reflects an earlier period of publishing art, namely the pre-digital period, when they actually commissioned paintings and then photographed them and put typeface over them. So I have some of the original art from some of those books, which has been really fun. I have the one, Jane and the Prisoner of Wool House, which is this wonderful naval cover against a stormy sea, and she's standing on the docks in Southampton. Those were totally different era, because now everything has to be a thumbnail, and it's all print, and it's all done on computer. The element of art has really disappeared from covers in publishing. And I think it's one of the great losses. It's like the loss of album covers in music with the end of vinyl. Um, as far as the titles go, they're all mine.
Okay. So we are West Hampton Free Library. We're hosting this. And what part have libraries played in your life, perhaps in your writing or just overall in your life?
Well, I grew up in a family of 6 girls, and I'm the youngest, which is why Pride and Prejudice made sense to me. I apparently was supposed to be Lydia, but everybody thinks they're actually Lizzie. Nobody thinks they're Lydia. Um, but I grew up going to local libraries where, if you remember, you signed the card. And I could look on the card and see my older sister's names on the same books. And that was a wonderful sense of tradition, both in reading and in library use, and learning how to become a library reader. So that's been wonderful for me. I value libraries hugely in advancing my readership because so many people love the fact that a library buys the book and offers it to them in various formats, and that's really important. Audio and digital as well. So that's all important to me. As a researcher, however, libraries have been indispensable. So I tend to really be talking of archives in this sense. For example, in writing a book I put out a couple of years ago called That Churchill Woman, which is about Jenny Jerome Churchill, the mother of Winston Churchill, who was an American child raised in Newport and Manhattan and Paris before she settled in England. I had to go into the Winston Churchill archives at Cambridge, and I had to actually pay £600 for access for a year to the digital resources there so I could use them when I came back. But they have all of Jenny's letters and letters to Winston and his letters to her when he was 13 from prep school, and her letters to her father, and just being able to read the actual handwriting of Jenny's, read telegrams that were written to her after her husband Randolph's death, some from her lover. It's just an extraordinarily rich experience to have access to that kind of material. Same with my book about Jack Kennedy. I was researching him while he was at Harvard as a 22-year-old. His senior thesis is there. All of his school records are there. All the comments of his teachers on his writing, his advisors. His advisor turned out to be a member of FDR's kitchen cabinet. And so I was able immediately to connect him to FDR, which I needed to do in that book. It lists his summer reading list. So I knew what he was reading that summer. It had all of his passports because passports were issued then per trip. You had to give them back after you re-entered the country, and so you only had them for the duration of the trip. So there is a compilation of his passports throughout the years, and you see him growing up in the photographs, but also he's listed differently: brown hair, black hair, dark hair, hazel eyes, green eyes, blue eyes. And you realize he probably had hazel eyes and they looked a different color depending on what he was wearing in these passports. And so, the stuff that you find in archives and libraries is just extraordinary for anybody trying to recreate a world that feels lost.
Yeah. I think we're going to let it now open up so that if you have any questions, any of our participants, please go ahead and type them into the chat. I'm going to also share Stephanie's website. We did have a question of, do you write under any other names? So you might know her as Francine Matthews or Stephanie Barron. So Stephanie's website is now in the chat. You can click on that and see what other books she has. So Stephanie, while people are thinking of the questions that maybe they want to ask you, are you working on anything currently Jane Austen based, or what are you working on?
I'm not working on anything Jane Austen based, and I've taken a hiatus from writing. I am considering a contemporary spy novel, but having brought Jane to the end of her life, that chapter is concluded. I've had people say, why don't you write prequels and so forth? And I actually personally think that series revolving around a particular character have a natural life, and you prolong them at your peril. They start to feel stale, they start to feel contrived. And so I don't want to interpolate the existing series with other novels set at different years. So that's not something I'm going to do. I do love women's historical fiction, though, and so writing about, say, Churchill or Virginia Woolf or something like that kind of fiction always interests me. But it's generally not random. It's generally triggered by a specific idea, and I don't know that that's out there yet.
Okay. So we have a question from Rosanna. She wanted to know if your work on Winston Churchill's boarding school experiences influenced your writing of Jane and the Final Mystery.
Yes, absolutely. absolutely. So he was sent away to school at age 8 and nearly died there of pneumonia. Um, he was at a school in Brighton. Winston had a lot of difficulty in school and did not go to the schools his father had attended, and his father despised him. So the fact that Winston did not go to Eton but went to Harrow, for example, when he was 11, was a huge black mark against him in his father's estimation. Um, he went to Sandhurst as a cavalry officer, and his father deplored that. He felt that because he wasn't going to Oxford, it was bad enough, but going to Sandhurst as a cavalry officer was demeaning because the politically influential positions were in the infantry. And so everything Winston did was difficult within his family context and his political context as a family. His father was an MP and had been expected to be prime minister at one point. So thinking about his experiences of being beaten at his primary school, and the way that was simply taken in stride uh, was to me just very influential on Jane and the Final Mystery. But that is set at Winchester in 1817, and it's a very different time than Winston experienced in the 1880s. Winchester had a rebellion at the time that I was writing about it, and there's a lot of literature and biographies and group biographies written about that period that you can find if you're doing research and get a sense of what the daily routine at Winchester was, distinct from, say, Harrow or its feeder schools.
So we have a question from Marlene. She wanted to know, which of your novels would you suggest if she wanted to pair it with a Sanditon discussion? That's an interesting
Jane and the Wandering Eye, which is set in Bath. It is set fairly early in her life, in the life of the series, rather. It's the third book. It's about theater and the aristocracy in the season at Bath, and I think that could be a fun one for you.
Thank you. Erin, did you have any other questions that were
I
submitted?
do. If you could cast the Jane Mystery series as a series, who could you see playing Jane?
Someone unknown.
Hmm.
I think it would have to be someone completely unknown, British, who are able to affect a British persona. But I think it needs to be someone who is not identifiable with a host of other roles, because you want to come to it fresh without a preconception of who Austen was. So I have no one to offer you.
No. Rachel, do you have any others?
Have you seen the series Miss Austen that was on PBS? And do you have any thoughts on that series?
I have not yet watched it. I'm waiting so I can watch it just straight through, and I haven't had that block of time. I like the woman playing her very much, so I think it'll be interesting. And I'll be interested on their take on Cassandra's destruction of her work, her letters, rather. Because that's such a culturally dictated thing that Cassandra outlived Jane from the wildness of the Regency period into the more constrained and staid Victorian era, and grew almost ashamed of her frankness.
So when you're writing your Jane Austen mysteries, when you wrote them,
Mhm.
did you plot them out? Did you know from the beginning who done it, or did the story unfold to you as you were writing it?
So that's really a question about detective novel plotting, because that's fundamental to anything you write. People vary in their opinions on this. It's common to say that people are either plotters or pantsers, meaning they write by the seat of their pants or wait for the muse. I am a plotter. I'm a very I I write outlines and then I write outlines within the outlines and that kind of thing. But I always start with the ending. In the case of the Jane books, I misspoke. In the case of the Jane books, I start with a period in her letters that she has either nothing written, like a gap in the letters that I can fill, or I start with a very prescriptive letter, like the ones I mentioned in Lyme Regis, where she's mentioning everything, the weather, whether the moon was out, where they went that night to play cards, who her mother partnered in whist. I mean, you get so many details that you almost have the book's structure there. But then I look at the political climate. What's happening in England at the time that's compelling? Because often that factors into the plot of the novel. As I said, I wanted to introduce the politics and the military aspects of her time. Then I start with the end of the book. And the ending tells you so much you need to know. It tells you who killed whom and why. If you figure that out first, you have the pebble that you've dropped into the water. And all these rings start to come out from that pebble. If you understand why someone would do something so profound as take another person's life, you suddenly know their relationship, whether it's one of hatred or betrayal or love. And then you start to think about how each of them arrived at that point of violence and conflict and death. And then you start knowing things about their lives, who they are, who are the people around them. And you suddenly start building this whole world that goes backward to the origin of the story. So I always start my plotting from the end. And then you think about the initiating moment and scene. What is less well defined is the middle. And I rarely plot that extensively at the outset because to me, that's where the creative process occurs. And it's very influenced by the characters speaking to one another. Once they start speaking, they have their individual voices. They determine a great deal of how they are authentically going to act through the rest of the book. And so I have had it, and I do think it's the creative process working, where my ending has to be tweaked because the characters have changed the progress of the story. And by the time we get to that ending, it's been altered by their actions and their choices, which sounds more woo-woo than it actually is. Most authors will tell you that happens because there's a limitation to what you can foresee and map and what actually occurs in the process of generating the story.
Now, as you can tell, we do have some writers in our group.
Oh, good.
What is a piece of advice, something that when you were starting out in your writing, that you wish someone had told you? Any sage advice or words that you would like to pass on to someone who's interested in writing?
Two things. One is that we're all too grateful, meaning people desperately want to be published and they will leap at any chance to be so because it's validating and it legitimates the work. And your gratitude towards someone for recognizing what you've done and valuing it can undermine what it's really worth. And what I'm trying to say is don't be too grateful. Know your own worth. Don't need to be validated by someone offering to publish you for a pittance. Pursue what may seem harder. And, too many writers are grateful to be paid for what they do, and it's ridiculous. And in this era of AI, whenever, all of my books, all 31 of my novels are in the Meta large learning model, pirated. So anything you write today is going to be pirated. And you need to value it first and have someone else value it appropriately. And that's a really critical piece of advice if you are going into this as a profession. Secondly, if you are merely writing because you love to write, I would say never believe people who say write what you know. I think that is the worst piece of advice anybody can possibly hear. I have never written what I know. I write what I find compelling, and I go and teach myself about it, and I learn enough about it to then write about it fluently. And that learning process is the greatest gift in writing the book that I've ever experienced. The writing is secondary. It's the deep absorption into the material that underpins the novel that to me is really worthwhile.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Oh, you're welcome.
thank you.
Yes, wonderful, wise words for our writers in the group. Rachel, did you have anything? You're
Well,
good?
I'm gonna put Francine's, Stephanie's email, website again into the chat so that people who are looking for other series to read or other books, please visit her website and check out, see what titles there you haven't read yet. But no, that
I
was the
would I would
last.
also say if you type stephaniebarron.com,
Mm-hmm.
it'll get you to the same place. Both
Okay.
author names go to the same site. So you can just plug my name into Google and you'll have it.
And so if anyone is interested, I thought I saw in the chat someone asked if you were going to make an appearance somewhere. So I would assume that any sort of events or promotional tours or speaking engagements will be on your website as well or your social media.
Yes, I should say that I have largely retired, Erin. I lost my younger son 2 years ago and pretty much stopped writing after that. Um, so I'm not really appearing a ton of places. I love to do things like this where I'm talking to readers, but I'm not marketing books right now. So they're more likely to be online appearances or discussions, and the occasional JASNA annual general meeting, um, that sort of thing.
Okay, great. Thank you for letting us know about that.
Sure.
Yeah,
Sure.
thank you so much for joining us, though. This has been a lot of
Oh,
fun.
it's wonderful. I
Yeah.
wish I'd gotten to hear more voices because I love the dialogue rather than feeling like it's, a monologue. But I love talking to the two of you, and I hope others got something out of it. And happy summer reading, everyone.
Yes,
Thank you so much for
definitely.
coming. It was a real pleasure.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you so
Good.
much for
Thank
joining
you.
us. Please keep in touch. Let us know how you're doing.
Okay,
You're always welcome to join us for any of our book discussions or
great,
chats.
great. I hope you'll keep me on your
Absolutely.
list.
I will. But everyone, thank you for joining us tonight. A special thank you to our guest for joining us, and we will see you at our next meeting. Have a wonderful night, everyone.
Thank
Good night,
you.
everyone.
Thank
Everyone.
you. Thank you
Thank
so
Bye.
you
much.